Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to kind of a show I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I finally sat down and said, you know what? It's going to happen today. I've had many people ask me and question me over the years, Pete, so who's your favorite band now? Is it Black Sabbath or is it Deep Purple? And over the years, many have asked me in the comments, and every so often I will answer, and I'm like, well, today or these last couple of months or this last year, it's been Deep Purple. And then a year might go by, and then someone will ask again. It's like, wow, who's your favorite now? And I'd be like, it's kind of been Sabbath lately. So it led me to think that and ponder that this has been a question that I've been asking myself for a long time. Because quite frankly, since probably 1979 or so, Deep Purple and Black Sabbath have been flip-flopping as my two favorite bands, with the exception of two brief periods of time. And that would probably be maybe 1986 to 1989, where I think Metallica was my favorite band for those couple of years, for those 3 or 4 years. I just was seeing Metallica live in concert constantly, just totally enamored with, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and then Justice for All. And even, the beginning of the Black album period, just Metallica were on top of the world, and they were on top of my world. I still loved Purple and Sabbath, but, Metallica for those few years, just, wow. Right? But then I started to, move on to other things. I discovered Dream Theater, okay, right in the early 90s there, with Images and Words, and Dream Theater became so much a part of all of everything that I listened to and talked about, and again started seeing the band live constantly. Really got into prog heavily in the early 90s, all throughout the decade. So for a good handful of years, Dream Theater were my go-to band, but I still listened to Sabbath and Purple quite a bit. But then as I started to kind of circle back on heavier stuff again and getting a little older and moving back to classic stuff that I grew up with, the specter of Deep Purple and Black Sabbath came roaring back. They never left, but they became, once again, those two go-to bands. And for, a number of years, Purple were the reunited Purple, reinvigorated Purple with Steve Morse, and I'm heavily into all those albums, and just made me appreciate the older albums even more. I all of a sudden was like, okay, I went through that prog binge in the 90s, and there's some really good proggy things to love about Deep Purple's music, and so Purple became my number one band, sort of again. I don't know if they ever really misplaced Sabbath as my number one band back in the late 70s, early 80s. They were close. And then Sabbath reunites with Dio. They reunite with Ozzy. There's all this stuff going on. Dio passes away, and Sabbath became my number one band again. And then Purple became my number one band again. And Sabbath became my number one band again. And I'm like, which one is it, Pete? I don't know. So I decided today, we're going to go on YouTube and we're going to talk a little bit about why these two bands keep flip-flopping back and forth. And who's your favorite today? Today, December 21st. All right, so let's go way back. So when I first discovered Black Sabbath with this album, Paranoid, in 1979, pretty sure it was 1979, I was 13 years old, right? This changed my world. I hadn't started listening to Deep Purple yet. I started listening to Deep Purple probably in 1980, not long after. I bought that Deepest Purple compilation, that I was hooked. But this completely changed my life. Okay. And it wasn't until I bought that Deepest Purple compilation, and then, of course, followed that up with, let me just find it here, followed that up with this, Made in Japan, that all of a sudden I was like, holy cow, Ritchie Blackmore, Ian Gillan, John Lord, Ian Pace, Roger Glover. Yeah, I like this. Blackmore instantly became my favorite guitar player. And I love the unpredictability of it all. Music was heavy, not quite Black Sabbath heavy, but pretty rockin'. Ian Gillan's screaming vocals just resonated with me from the very, very beginning. Totally different than Ozzy. And those big doomy riffs, which I love from Sabbath, not really a part of Purple, more bluesy, but there were aspects of both bands that just really appealed to me, like in a major way, right? So from there, of course, going in lots of different directions here. So, with Sabbath, of course, I got Paranoid. Then I had to get this. And then, of course, you had to get this. And you had to get this. And this became my favorite Sabbath album, maybe in the mid-'80s. This kind of became my favorite. Paranoid was my favorite for many years. But then all of a sudden, Master Reality and this, started to creep up. Of course, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Always really liked that album. I think I like it even more now than I did back then. I was never a huge Sabotage fan back in the day. Love it now, right? And, while I'm doing that, I'm catching up on my Purple love, right? So I discovered, I held off getting some of the Purple studio albums for a couple of years because I had the compilation and I had the live album. So I had a lot of their best tracks, but of course that was never enough for me. So I went and got In Rock. Mind blown. I went and got Fireball. I think before I got any of those, I got Machine Head. Right? And, many years later, I went and backtracked and I, went to get the first few Deep Purple albums, which I like. I don't love, right? They're good for what they are, but it's not quite the same. And then, slowly, because on that Deepest Purple compilation, you had a couple of the Mark III era songs on there. You had, I believe, Mistreated, Stormbringer, and Burn. Right? So then, of course, you got to go get these two, which I loved. Right? Eventually, I went and got this, which I didn't really care for much for many years. I was always kind of like, come taste the band. It's okay. Now, absolutely love it. Because, of course, back in the day, I was like, no Richie Blackmore. Now I'm kind of like, Tommy Bolin, really good. Right? It's different. Is it traditional Deep Purple? Maybe not. Still really good. And then I discovered this, which blew my mind. And for me, one of the great things about Deep Purple back, like now we're talking about like early, mid-'80s, is that they had these live albums that were just blowing my mind. Whereas Sabbath, Live at Last finally surfaced at some point, shitty sounding recording and everything. I had it, though, on vinyl. And I was like, okay, this is really good. It's Sabbath, Ozzy-era Sabbath, and it's pretty crushing, kind of sloppy in spots and not well recorded, but it's still really good. But until Live Evil, which I have it here somewhere. Where is that? Until Live Evil, never really got a full-fledged official Sabbath live album. So for me, on the live album front, Purple was killing it, or had already killed it, right? And Sabbath, not quite there. I love Live Evil, don't get me wrong, and love Live at Last as well. But not quite up to the level of made in Japan and made in Europe, right? So, but of course, when I'm heavily, and this is the weird thing, right, about getting into bands late, when I'm totally getting into Purple, they're non-existent. They're broken up. They haven't been anything for years. You got Ian Gillan is doing the Gillan Band, right? You got Richie Blackmore's in Rainbow, and the Gillan Rainbow story. That's something else. I'll maybe touch on that a little bit, along with Whitesnake. You got Coverdale in Whitesnake, Glenn Hughes off doing a million things, right? So Purple hasn't been anything for so long. And when I started getting into Sabbath heavily, Ozzy's gone. Right? By the time, when I first got into Black Sabbath with the Paranoid album in 1979, Ozzy is already gone from Sabbath. And they're in this little flux period. And it's like almost like I turned around and remember like hearing all the, reading in the magazines and stuff like that, kids talking in school, there's a new Black Sabbath album, Heaven and Hell. Like, oh, awesome. Went out and bought that, put it on. I'm like, that's not Ozzy. That's Ronnie James Dio. And I'm like, not overly familiar with him, right? I would be very shortly thereafter, right? Because once I completely fell in love with Heaven and Hell, I'm off discovering Rainbow Rising and the first Richie Blackmore's Rainbow and Long Live Rock and Roll and the On Stage album and all that other stuff, right? So there's this whole like kind of like windmill effect, right? Jumping in the rabbit hole, right? So, but now all of a sudden, the Ronnie James Dio version of Black Sabbath becomes my world. So, we've got, where are we here? Brought all my props today. We've got these two, which I had on vinyl, and I playing these constantly. To now, like, there is no competition for number one. It's Black Sabbath. To the point where for a few years, I was like, my de facto Black Sabbath listening were these two albums. And then when Live Evil came out, I was all in. All right, okay, great. All right, we finally got a live album from this version of the band. Love it. Awesome. And then by the time it actually comes out, though, you're starting to read in the newspapers and the metal magazines that Ronnie and Vinny are no longer in the band. I was crushed. Absolutely crushed. I remember like it was yesterday hearing that they were gone. And I was just like, my world had ended, right? That was, 83, right? Something like that. I'm a teenager. And I'm just like, how can this be? How could they have done this to me, right? Well, then you start to hear the stories of, Ronnie starting his own band called Dio. And I'm like, all right, but still there's the Sabbath thing. What is Sabbath going to do? And then you start to hear the rumblings. And then the news comes out that Ian Gillan, my beloved singer from that other band, has joined Tony, Geezer, and Bill in Black Sabbath. And they're going to put out an album, and they're going to do a tour. And I'm like, so one day I'm like, crying about Dio leaving Sabbath. And the next day I'm like, holy shit, my two worlds are colliding. Yeah. All is well in the Pardo camp once again. So, that comes out. I see them on tour. I absolutely adore the album. But then once again, at the end of the tour, you hear the news, the rumors that Ian Gillan and Black Sabbath go their separate ways. Why? Because Deep Purple Mark II is reuniting. They're getting together in Vermont, in Stowe, Vermont. I had just started college, September 1984. I remember, in fact, I still have the issue somewhere of Kerrang! Magazine, right? We're talking about the reunion, talking about the recording of the album, and all of a sudden now this is a big, big deal. So I'm back on the Purple train again, right? So Sabbath now is kind of like, we don't know where they're going, but this is happening. Saw the tour, bought the album, all of a sudden Deep Purple's everything now. Woo! Great, right? And at this point in time, Purple might be my favorite band, right? Because they're back, it's fresh, new album is great. This is right before the Metallica train kind of settles in. So I'm like, okay. So meanwhile, then shortly after that, the tour comes out, the next album comes out, and that's pretty good. Not quite as good as that. And then all of a sudden, you start to hear the rumblings in the Purple camp once again. Richie and Ian aren't getting along, blah, 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 right? We've been down this road before, but at this time, I am already firmly entrenched in Metallica, all right? But during that same time, Black Sabbath reconvene, sort of, all right? Was originally intended that way, but it was going to be a Tony Iommi solo album. And instead, Glenn Hughes, formerly of, these albums, is now singing for Black Sabbath. Whoa! That's kind of cool. Once again, my worlds are colliding, and I'm like, great. So I get this album. I like this album quite a lot. Most people kind of don't or ignore it, right? Because it's just Tony and a bunch of other guys, one kind of legend in the band and Glenn Hughes, but a bunch of other dudes. They go out and tour. The tour's a big catastrophe and disaster because, of course, Glenn is mired in drug addiction at the time and he can't sing, and there's all sorts of stories about what happened on the tour. I saw one of the shows where he sang. He was awful. I can't believe I'm actually saying that Glenn Hughes was ever awful in a live atmosphere, because he, for 3 decades now has been the voice of rock and amazing. But back on the Seven Star tour, he was terrible. And he was booted from the band and from the tour, despite the fact that this being a really, really strong album. All right, so Sabbath's still in disarray. Purple's kind of in disarray because, then all of a sudden Ian Gillan is out, and in comes Joe Lynn Turner. Joe Lynn Turner, of course, very familiar to Ritchie Blackmore fans and Mr. Blackmore himself and Roger Glover, because he was the singer for the last lineup at the time of Rainbow, right? Of course, from Straight Between the Eyes and, Difficult to Cure, so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, Ritchie thinks it's a great idea to bring Joe into the band, and now we have Deep Rainbow, right? Fine album for what it is. Not one of my favorites. And it's funny because I really like that last incarnation there of Rainbow. However, I don't want my Deep Purple sounding like that. So to me, this was kind of a miss for me. So I'm at a point, I'm kind of not digging where Purple is at, right? And they eventually reconvene with Gillan back in the band. But of course, Gillan and Blackmore always going to be at odds. So Ritchie eventually leaves. Purple is now in disarray once again. Gee, what a surprise. Meanwhile, because there is always a meanwhile. Let me find all my stuff here. Mr. Iommi decides, well, you know what? We're going to put another lineup of Black Sabbath together, right? And first, Ray Gillan, who took over for Glenn Hughes on that tour, was going to be singing on the next album. Eternal Idol. Then it winds up being a pretty unknown guy named Tony Martin. They release a series of albums. Cozy Powell joins the band. You got Neil Murray joins the band on bass. Of course, Neil Murray has history in this family tree with Whitesnake, right? It gets more complicated. Then, Geezer comes back, then he leaves, whatever. You got Tony and Cozy kind of fronting the band. You got, Eternal Idol. You got Cross Purposes, Headless Cross, a whole bunch of really strong albums. Nobody's really listening. I'm into it. But I'm kind of like, again, this is like late 80s going to the early 90s. I'm loving, I shouldn't say I'm loving. I'm liking the new version of Sabbath, but I'm not as entrenched in it as I was with the Dio era stuff and the original Ozzy albums. Okay. They get back with Ronnie and Vinny. They release Dehumanizer. I'm all supercharged for it again. But again, this is during my Dream Theater days. So remember, Dream Theater is my favorite band during this time, early 90s, early mid-90s. And then, but you blink and Ronnie's gone again. And they go back to Tony Martin. Ronnie goes back to the Dio band, puts the Dio band back together. All during this, Deep Purple has got to reconvene, right? Where's all my stuff here? I'm trying to find all the correct props, people. I grabbed so much stuff. Anyway, maybe I didn't grab it. Oh, it's here somewhere. Anyway, Joe Satriani joins Purple for a spell. I didn't grab any of my newer Purple albums. And then Steve Morse joins the band. Of course, Steve Morse from the Dixie Dregs, Kansas, Steve Morse band, right? Kind of an odd choice, I thought, but I've loved Steve Morse forever, and so I'm willing to give it a go. I'm like, to me, did it hurt that Blackmore was no longer there? Yes. But I wasn't completely devastated because, after being a fan of this band for so long, and to see this constant leave, come back, leave, come back, leave, come back. I know Ritchie very well, not personally, but I know his history. I know his habits, and I can tell the patterns, right? And I was like, Ritchie's never coming back. That's it. It's done. And personally for me, I want this band to continue. You still have, four classic members in Lord, Pace, Glover, and Gillan. So you bring in Steve Morse. They released a Perpendicular album. Oh, here it is, right in front of me. It's sitting there. I have a whole stack of stuff. So we got Perpendicular comes out. Amazing. I'm like, wow. Purple is totally killing it still, right? And that was the beginning of a series of albums. The got Abandoned, you got, Now What, and what else? Infinite, and Whoosh, and all of a sudden, it's like, holy crap! Purple are, to me, are trying to recapture their glory years with a brand new guy in the band who seems to have reinvigorated the whole rest of the band. So now we're going into the late 90s into the early 2000s. So I'm already well into and kind of past my infatuation with all that is prog rock throughout the 90s, and I'm getting back into heavier music once again. So I'm all of a sudden, I dabbled a little bit in new metal, but then I started to experiment with extreme metal, right? Progressive metal, and all the classic heavy bands, right? So all this stuff is coming back to me. I'm getting into all sorts of new stuff. And while all this is going on, Sabbath are pretty quiet. But eventually they reunite once again with Ronnie and put together, in a few years, Heaven and Hell, right? Which, great for me. Loved going to saw them a couple times on those few tours, and loved everything. It was just all of a sudden to be a Sabbath fan again was a good thing. So now all of a sudden you've got my two all-time favorite bands are kind of back in the spotlight, and I'm like, okay, this is really cool. But before then, even before then, we had the original guys getting back together, right, for the late '90s for the reunion, right, with Bill and Ozzy and whatnot. And I remember seeing that tour and thinking, it's great, again, Sabbath is back, but, that only lasted so long. So then going into the 2000s, you got Heaven and Hell, right? You got Ozzy's solo careers going still. You got Deep Purple with Steve Morse releasing some killer stuff. John Lord passes away, right? Terrible. In comes Don Airey, right, who has played with all these bands. He comes in to replace John Lord, and they don't miss a beat, right? We miss John so much, but Purple just keeps continuing on releasing good music. And I am so into the Now What and Infinite albums and Whoosh and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, Purple is back to being my favorite band. And I've gone to see Purple with Steve Morse in concert so many times, and I love all these albums, these Morse era albums. And, during this time, Sabbath is, and then Ronnie Dio passes away, right? Ronnie James Dio passes away, so there's really nothing going on there for a bit. So Purple has become my de facto favorite band. Still love Dream Theater, right? But, I've gone back to my classic roots here. Eventually, the guys in Sabbath, minus Bill Ward, get back together with Ozzy, and they come and put out 13, which I like quite a bit. Saw them a couple times on the End tour. Mind-blowing for me because other than, on the reunion tour in the 90s, I had never seen Sabbath with Ozzy, so it was good for me to see them a couple more times with Ozzy, not quite the original lineup because no Bill Ward. And I really like this album a lot, but that would be it, right? They wouldn't release any other albums. So I kind of was like, okay, still love Sabbath, but Purple is a regular band again. And again, I think that has a lot to do with it. It's they're just regularly putting out albums every couple of years, touring every year, so they became a regular part of my life again. And I started going out and, re-listening to a lot of the old classic stuff. And, that was that. And plus, too, we had a surplus of, great live albums from the vaults. From Deep Purple, man, that just things were coming out. Some had been around for a while, right? Other things, that just kept popping up. All these great concerts from all their different eras. Mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so on. And all of a sudden, I'm just we're getting new studio records. We're getting archival live stuff from Purple. There's all this Deep Purple commotion going on. So for probably a good decade, I was Purple is back to being my number one favorite band. And so fast forward to the last year or so, and since the band released Whoosh, which I love quite a bit, they put out that kind of COVID covers album, which I did not like at all. And I was kind of all right, Purple's had a really good ride for me. And I started listening to a lot of old Sabbath. Specifically the early Ozzy era album. Still love the Dio stuff, obviously, don't get me wrong. But I guess because I started to listen to even more than normal. I'm a big Doom fan, but I started listening to a lot more Doom and stoner rock bands who obviously owe so much to the original Ozzy era of Black Sabbath, that I started listening to more of the early Ozzy era albums than I have in, the last decade or two. So I've been regularly playing like this stuff over the last like maybe year, maybe not quite year. And all of a sudden now it's like the last few months anyway, when I go to reach for one of my two favorite bands here, I've been reaching for Sabbath over Purple. So yes, so today, December 21st, 2022, Black Sabbath reigns supreme for now, right? But Purple's right behind them. They're never too far from each other. And again, I talked before about this whole like kind of family tree, and my like listening habits of my favorite bands from when I was a kid till today. It's amazing how if you look at I've got videos here on the channel where I talk about my favorite bands of all time. And if you look at like who sits at the top, who's there? Sabbath, Purple, Whitesnake, Rainbow, Uriah Heep, Zeppelin, right? Of all the classic bands. And, they're somewhat all related in a weird way, right? Maybe not musically, certainly from where they come from, right? They're all British bands, from the Midlands and Birmingham and all these places, Manchester, all these folks from these bands are all like from that same kind of area. And in many cases, the family tree is littered with people jumping ship from one band to the other. I mean, how many guys who were in Rainbow have been in Whitesnake, who have been in Sabbath, who have been in Purple, who have been in Heap, and there's just all this, not so much Heap, I guess, but there's all this jumping around. And they're all friends, and you have like so many of these like just classic and legendary musicians who Bonham and Ward and Pace and Kerslake and Powell and Iommi and Blackmore and Page and Box and Iommi and just Marsden and Moody, all these like legendary figures. And to me, I have always been absolutely obsessed with all of these bands, this handful of bands that we're talking about here. Granted, Sabbath and Purple have always been the top two, but the other few of them, they're always there. And to me, just they make up this kind of like legendary group of British heavy rock bands that have shaped my life and given my life so much joy for the last 40 some odd years, right? 45 years. It's about 45 years now because I'm going to be 57. So really, realistically, I've been listening to all these bands since I was 12 or 13 years old. So, but again, talk to me in 6 months from now, right? Purple's probably going to put out another new album in 2023, and I'll probably be totally into that, and that'll spur me into listening to all the classic and more recent Purple stuff once again. Maybe they'll come out with another couple archival live albums, and I'll be like, yes, we're going to do it all over again, and I'll go through another period where Purple is my favorite band. So who knows? All I can say is, for those of you who are going to continue to ask me, and now after watching this video, I'm sure you guys are going to ask me more often than you do. Like, so today, Pete, who's your favorite band? Sabbath or Purple? Well, today it's Sabbath, right? But again, ask me a couple months from now, it might swing back to Purple because that's what I've been doing my entire life. The pendulum swings from one of them to the next, but I think the end result is I absolutely adore both of these bands. These bands are the two most important musical acts in Pete Pardo's history, and that there's no confusion on that. So whether one tips over the other a little bit at any given time, it doesn't really matter because together they make up my musical DNA in a big way, and that's all I got to say about that. So thanks for tuning in to this little bit of hyperbole here, me talking about two bands that I love, and whenever I can talk about the two bands that I love the most in the world, makes me happy, right? So hopefully you get some enjoyment out of this. But please do in the comments below, let us know how you feel about these two bands and how they stack up in your personal favorites, and whether you favor one over the other, or maybe you don't like either one of them, and that's cool too, right? Because we all shouldn't like all the same things, and we don't like all the same things. So thanks for watching. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together all the damn time. Stay tuned for more content here coming up. We got tomorrow, The Monster's Den, where the crew and myself will be reviewing the new installation of the Hellraiser franchise, which just came out this year. We've also got Martin Popoff and myself at the Funhouse Friday morning. Saturday is the UK Connection with Stephen Reed, Simon Ray, and myself, and we will be ranking the songs on a classic album. That album is Rammstein's Mutter album. So that's coming up tomorrow. And then, of course, we've got ranking the albums coming up on Sunday, and that will be Tom Petty album ranking with a few of my colleagues, and we'll be going through all 16 studio albums, so stay tuned for that. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click on that notification bell so you get alerted of all of our content as it posts. Please also hit the like button before you leave, and down below we've got the links to our Ko-Fi page for channel donations, as well as our merch page where you can get all sorts of cool Sea of Tranquility shirts like this one. I absolutely love this serpent or snake shirt. I love how on the design's got little skulls and stuff all over it. Very, very cool. David did a great job on these. So very colorful, love the colors. Awesome shirt. So we've got, like I said, all different designs. We even have a lot of the designs on zip-up hoodies now. So if you like the zippered hoodies, you got the SOT logo on the front and then the actual design on the back. So very, very cool stuff. So hopefully you can order and get them in time for Christmas. That might be kind of pushing it, but after Christmas, certainly. So thanks for watching, everybody. I'm Pete Pardo. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.